Hi, everybody. Just reflecting on the week we've had here in Philadelphia for AAM conference. Quite a few people I was speaking to earlier in the week who were there for the first start of the conference, but weren't able to stick around until the end of the conference. Now, our presentation was on Saturday morning, with it being Memorial Day weekend. A lot of people were leaving, so I thought it might be handy to put a small condensed version of our presentation up on here for people to view. I'll skip through the videos. I'll put those into put links to those into the comments. But yeah, it's been a fantastic week. So thanks to everyone who's chatted and presented this week. I feel like I've learned a huge amount, which has been great. So the presentation at the conference was with Chris Warren and with Chris Conte, as well as myself. I won't try and cover all of their parts. I'll try and kind of give the headlines, if you like, so you get a little bit of the technical and curatorial flavour of our presentation as well. But I'll try and mainly sort of just focus and reflect on the bits that I was covering. So yeah, our focus was on Encounters, which opened a year ago this weekend at the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City. The focus for the presentation was very much on the idea of authenticity. So it's interesting to come to events like this and see a variety of different types of presentations about a lot of different types of topics. And the word immersive came up over and over and over and over again. What I found really interesting was that the word immersive was used as a synonym for lots of other things. Often that was to do with scale, just big things. Often it was to do with use of technology, i.e. this is a thing that's driven by technology. And sometimes it was to do with spectacle. What we've tried to really convey in this presentation is that Encounters is about none of those things. Ideally, things like the technology becomes imperceptible to the viewer. What we're trying to do is immerse people in narrative. So this is about finding authenticity in our delivery, in our storytelling, and allowing visitors to be lost in that storyline. We started with an overview of collaborators. Obviously, as I say, it was myself, Electrosonic, and Chris from the museum team who were presenting. But ultimately, this is a body of work that took a huge number of people working together collegiately, not least the exhibition design leadership from RAA, fabrication from JE Dunn. I won't read through the full list, but this was a great project with some fantastic partnerships involved. So we started the presentation with a background on the museum and its centrality to modern-day Kansas City. The team have been working through a huge gallery refresh. So Chris spoke about how him and his team and all the varied partners involved were able to sort of update and refresh the vast majority of the museum experience bit by bit and intentionally make things different whilst retaining a cohesive narrative. Chris Conte spoke about Electrosonic's role within that as a key partner throughout. And Chris spoke about the balance of new, ambitious activity alongside making this all work with pre-existing legacy systems. This is the space for Encounters. This is the starting point, really. So as you can see from the key plan there, the museum journey, people come in through the centre, if you like, of that shape, go around to the right, circle back and then come back through. So this is the penultimate gallery. So what you see in the image on the right was the starting point that included some legacy ceiling and architecture. It included a existing experience, but as you can see in the top left as well, that's a small snapshot from a list of 120 different stories that the museum possibly wanted to tell. At this stage, in terms of the brief, it was really clear from our first introduction to the project that the museum team didn't want to ask too much of the visitors. They didn't want them to read a lot. They didn't want them to have to make a lot of decisions. They didn't want them to have to interact, but they did want them to be immersed in individual stories that were being told by people who had a wide variety of different experiences within the war. So that was the point when we got involved, and our start point really is to work out what would the creative pillars be to start to frame this experience. So the first we looked at really was the idea of multiplicity. So what was really clear from this brief, we were going to tell a number of different stories, but overall there had to be an overarching message that war of this scale impacts so many different people in so many different ways. So we really wanted to get across the diversity of life that was impacted by war. We wanted people to come into the space and feel that this is a gallery full of stories. There's something really clear about identity as well. We wanted to get across the idea that when you're dealing with the sheer volume of people in war, individuals can lose their identity and be lost amongst the mass. So we wanted to get that across visually. At the same time, the flip side of that coin, I guess, is that these are individual stories from humans. Really conscious that as visitors uh, walk around this museum, there's lots of really, really interesting stuff, lots of objects, there's lots of narrative films, there are lots of interactive moments prior to reaching this point. But whilst they do hear narration in terms of voiceover content, they never actually hear directly the words of a person impacted by war. So we wanted this to be the moment where individuals step forward out of that mass and are able to tell their stories in the richness that they deserve. Likewise with the environment, we never wanted to be too literal with the storytelling. All of the stories in this gallery come from primary sources, which is incredibly important to us to retain that authenticity. So these were letters, they were diary entries. In one case, there was an audio recording later in life. In several cases, there were books that had been written later in life. So there's an element to which these are recollections of things that have happened rather than being told in real time. And we wanted that to be something that we could realise visually as well. And the last couple of things that we felt really important, the idea of dissimilarity. War is about destruction of norms. And, you look at a bombed out town or city, you even look at the structure of something like a trench. Warfare is about a lack of uniformity. We wanted to lean into that in our storytelling as much as our visual language. There are two sides to that coin as well, and the other is about the militaristic structures of war, the environments, the lines of symmetry, and that was something that was really important to get across here as well. So we really pulled all these thoughts together into the idea that individuals step out of the mass to speak to the impact that the Great War had on all of their lives. And that became our overarching proposition. The museum team invested in a discrete concept stage for this project, but that allowed us to get a good sense of the feasibility of the visitor experience, of the feasibility of this from a technical point of view, of the storytelling. It gave us a good chance to explore a lot of things. But one thing it did give us a chance to really sort of look at was just the concept art and what the ambition might be for how this is presented in terms of the visual layer. And what's really quite unique about this project is that these frames of concept art feel very, very similar to the final content as installed on site. And there are many reasons why that was the case. But I think one really clear reason that I enjoyed sharing on Saturday at the conference was there was a point within our first presentation. So we went through these slides as I'm showing you here today. Here's our overarching thinking in terms of the creative pillars. And then, here's what that might start to look and feel like 2 or 3 slides into this. And we were asked to stop by one of the museum team. And so our hearts were pounding, how we managed to drop the ball just a few slides into this massive pitch. And he actually he was sitting at the end of a long boardroom table, walked around the boardroom and walked up to the camera. And in that period of time, our brains are spinning around like a washing machine. But what he actually did was to, I wanted to stop you at this point because if you can deliver something that looks and feels like what you're describing, this is going to be incredible and this is going to be exactly what we need. And for us, that was such an impactful moment in the project. It was terrifying, but also I think it gave us that real confidence and clarity from the museum team that all of the design team, production team were able to coalesce around. We had a really clear vision. It was so clear how much the client team loved that. And so that allowed us to build from that confidence going forward, which was so incredibly important in terms of delivery. One thing that was crucial to getting this right was to go back to that idea of we want people to step into a space and understand they're seeing people at life size. We don't want them to start having to use touchscreens, making decisions, etc. We'll talk a bit more about the thinking behind that as we progress as well through these slides. But these were our initial storyboard frames. So you can see they start to pull in a lot of the ideas that we thought were important up front in terms of our creative pillars to really deliver on that authenticity. So you can see as you come in, there are LED strips that surround the room, there are silhouettes. So you can start to get that sense of the mass of people circling the room. You can see as the lady sketched here sort of steps into the first content alcove there. You can see that there's a series of cinemagraphs of people sort of waiting in the walls, if you like, ready to tell their story. And the way that we created those, the real nice subtle movement, it sort of really felt like the walls were alive with these stories. People were waiting to step forward and tell you their story. As you can see from the frames here, as the lady steps into the space, in this case, a child, Patrick, steps forward to tell his story. As part of this concept process, I think think we had 3 different scripts. We had several different storyboards, lots of different pieces of concept art, and not a lot varied from there really, because I think the idea was so clear and the conviction of all the team, and in particular the museum team, what they wanted to achieve was so clear, and that really helps. I think there's so many projects that we all work on where there isn't necessarily that clarity of thinking up front, but I think in this case, it really helped that was the case. This is where we started. So this is a very early prototype. James, our creative director, started to pull together at the beginning of the project. We used some kit that we had to hand, and we're looking at the idea of combination of screens, projections, the idea of using light in the absence of light, something like the shadow on the floor, something that was really, really key. And again, we'll talk about that as we progress through the slides. But we started to look at how this might come together, what that might mean in terms of a kit of parts to be able to pull this off. And at that point, that's when we were able to work with our partners. So working with Electrosonic, to establish, what would this mean to be able to create something that's going to have a lasting legacy as a piece of exhibition design. So it feels all the way through this experience like it is very much a real person stepping forward to tell a story rather than sort of being immersed in a space that's all about technology. In terms of the environment, wanted to keep this as simple as possible, to keep the experience sort of completely intuitive, but also to make this feel like this was a space that visitors were stepping into that intentionally felt like a bit of a bubble when compared to the rest of the visitor experience. We were briefed that we didn't want this to follow many of the rules that existed anywhere else. This was intentionally something completely different. So it was always intentional that we didn't want to ask a lot of visitors entering the space, but they needed some degree of context, and we wanted that context to be removed from the individual pieces of content that they would experience within the gallery itself. So the intro panel had to work very hard, and where we landed was the idea of their war, their words. There's a little bit more to it than that, but effectively we wanted it to be really clear that these were stories that people had written, that they documented in a variety of different ways because they wanted to communicate those stories. Again, going back to the idea of authenticity, we tried to edit these stories as little as possible, really, so that people step into the space and historical people from the past step forward and tell you their stories how they wanted them to be told. So you can see the green circles there represent our content alcoves, and the pink circles there represent the rest of the gallery in which have the silhouette animation. So as you step into this space, you get this sense of the mass sort of walk with that loss of identity, but then the individuals step forward in full colour to tell their story. So a lot of what we were trying to achieve there was around creating intimacy. So the idea that people felt personally addressed, it didn't feel like it was a passive experience. Everything that we did was around narrowing the emotional distance in terms of the storytelling to create that feeling of privacy with the first person narration. Keeping everybody at human scale was really important, being able to make sure that things like horizon lines were in the right place. Lots of things that we had to tweak in situ to get that right. The other thing really was to create authentic worlds for these people to live within, to tell their stories. So that idea of world building was really important. Such a variety of different vistas. So for example, this chap was a frontline chaplain, and his story is sort of questioning or speaking to his relationship with God and his faith. Really good example of how we wanted to create this window into somebody's world. So this vista of different screens that wasn't always literal, but really kind of gave a sense of time and place. We always knew, and we tested this throughout, that we wanted to stand around 6 feet away from this sort of array of screens and other pieces of technology. Reason being that then they could take in these full worlds, and that these worlds would be believable because they can see this sort of full vista around them. And so that really helped with things like pixel pitch for us to be able to go to Nanolumens in Atlanta and to work with their team in their workshop. Incredibly helpful. Trial test content right at the beginning of the project with stakeholders with us, so that everybody's comfortable that actually at a distance of 6 foot, this is the point when these pixels become imperceptible, and this feels like you're stood in front of a real person, in front of a real space. We played with a variety of different special effects as well. So we shot about 30 different people in period costume. They circled the room. This looping GIF kind of makes it look as though they're moving rapidly all the time. There's something that's quite ghostly and quite subtle about our delivery here. They don't constantly move. And again, getting the time with that was really important. Of course, there's always trick of the eyes is the absence of light that's suggestive of the human shape. But throughout trying to use a variety of visual technologies to allow people's eyes to do the stitching was really important. Another critical part was the audio as well. There was some sort of real technical challenges that you tend to get in these types of projects where we're trying to tell a lot of stories all at once. The use of Holoplot, the X2 Matrix speakers really helped with this. So the way this works is, these are speakers in the bottom left image. It's a audio beamforming technology. Went over to Berlin to do some testing in their shop over in Berlin. And I think I'd misused the term directional audio a few times and was corrected by the team there, which was really helpful. We went over to a cathedral, it's dome-shaped cathedral in Berlin, where this type of technology, slightly different product, is used. They've used it in mosques in Saudi Arabia as well. They use it in the Sphere in Vegas. The idea being that wherever you are within that space, the physics of the audio beamforming means that everybody gets a perfect audio wherever they are. And we use this to great effect. As visitors come into this space, there's a central audio theme that plays out. It's about 10 minutes long and creates a sense of time and place. As they then move around the space, we're able to do something quite unique, really. So within the museum space is obviously the idea of attractive modes. In almost all cases, the attractive modes tend to be visual. So the Holoplot sort of create almost like a sound bubble that us to step into. So we could use that to cycle through the various environments, from a battlefield to a peaceful garden to sort of the sound of a factory, munitions factory, to a bombed out church. We could play with these different environments that as visitors move around the space, they're audially pulled into spaces as well as visually. But whilst visitors are in those spaces, they can hear the speech of these individual people. So some of our stories are told with voiceover, narrated by the person on screen. Some of them are told directly to camera. That content comes out of the holoplots, but also above each person is a set of other speakers as well, which we used for sound effects, which had an intentional bleed to them. So that could be stood in alcove one, listening to a story about one particular person in one environment, but then be drawn towards a story elsewhere. So something really nice. I think lots of war museums do that incredibly well. Thinking about places like the Imperial War Museum in the UK, they have an intentional sound bleed that pulls you from gallery to gallery, and it's a really powerful experience. So all of that technical thinking was happening alongside the curatorial job. So one thing that we did really early on was to get together with a big group of stakeholders on site at the museum. And we did a number of things over a couple of days. So the museum has a fantastic collection of weaponry, clothing, all kinds of things from the First World War. Being able to walk around that collection and hear some of the stories was incredibly powerful for us in terms of us starting to form our thinking visually. And again, back to the idea of authenticity. We also did some script read-throughs, which allowed us all to start talking about, what if this particular story was presented in this particular way, which is great. Again, there was one in particular. There's a story of a chap called Ernst Toller, who's a German soldier who is describing the experience of finding human entrails on his pickaxe and really struggling with the position that he was in within the war. We sort of just floated the idea in this session, what if this was like a Macbeth kind of moment where he's endlessly polishing this pickaxe. We don't see any blood, we don't see any entrails, it's not that kind of film. But what if he's just there, just constantly, there's a metronomic picking in the background, the chinking of a pickaxe onto a trench. But this is all about him being lost in his thoughts and trying to process. And that, again, just an example, that was really, really well received and kind of gave us, I think, a little bit of creative freedom. This isn't about literal storytelling. This is a bold curatorial team, a bold, brave museum who are happy to tell these stories in ways that really pull visitors into the ideas. So we did those things alongside some paper prototyping on site as well. And one of the early conversations was around agency and around how much choice to give to visitors and about how we display these collections of stories. So myself and Joel, our design lead, printed out a bunch of faces without any context at all, really, and arranged them in different formations. We sat at a table towards the end of the visitor experience. So visitors had been through the museum at this point. It's fairly close to actually where the final gallery was to be situated. And what that allowed was for us just to have really useful conversations with visitors coming through to understand which stories they were drawn towards. Thinking back to those cinemagraphs that people see on screen, this is what visitors will be presented with. So were they drawn towards particular individuals? Were they drawn towards particular combinations? Was it the juxtaposition of different stories that would intrigue them? And what we found across the board really unanimously is that people liked the idea of intrigue. We live in a world where people kind of have endless decisions to make all day, every day. And I think particularly with content now, I sort of grew up in an era where we buy tapes and CDs and you were limited. You had your pocket money, you could afford to buy a certain number of things, and then you would listen to that one CD endlessly until you could afford the next one. Now you think about Spotify, you think about Netflix, there's just endless choice. And we've all done the thing where we sit forever flicking through Netflix for an hour instead of just watching something. And there's something really intriguing about this idea of agency and choice. And what we found through detailed conversations with people on site was that the idea of intrigue, curiosity, and some degree of serendipity were things that really stood out. So, a few examples. I remember several people sort of saying, this lady here looks Eastern European, perhaps, in terms of a costume. I'm intrigued by that story. There were several people who said, well, this looks like a Black American soldier. I don't know too much about that story, but I know that they weren't treated too well, so I'd like to find out more there. And these were the kind of pieces of feedback that we were getting. People were intrigued by young people were intrigued by old people were intrigued by the stories that they wouldn't necessarily gravitate towards. And I think that was a real win, really, for the project. There was always a sense that this wasn't going to be about the male military stories. And so the idea that actually visitors will be presented with stories that they wouldn't necessarily choose, but would gain a huge amount of value from was something that was really solidified in this user testing process. And that curatorial job continues sort of all the way through. This was the photo on the right there was actually taken during our shoots. So trying to get that balance right, really, in terms of collections of stories. These stories are grouped within the experience per alcove. So we have 16 stories in groups of 4. There isn't an assumption that somebody goes to alcove 1 and watches all 4, enjoys all 4 stories. That's not necessarily the reality of the visitor experience. People move around intentionally within the gallery due to that gallery exhibition design that I was describing earlier. But what's interesting here, I think, is that there's no right and wrong answer. Various people were able to pull these stories together into different combinations, and there's always a justification for those combinations. And I think what we were able to get towards is a final set of decisions that everybody was happy with, that felt like there was the right juxtapositions between different stories. So another thing we did was sort of full-scale testing on site, and this was another thing that the museum team invested in. Really, really important. This is the first time the content met the technology. So you can see here, these are the blades, LED Martin blades that are used around the room to carry these silhouettes. You can see at this stage nothing's working, which is often the case with this kind of mock-ups. We used projection in this case rather than the LED screens, as they weren't quite ready at this stage. But we were able to mock up the full experience, and by doing it on site as well, we were able to involve a lot of the museum's team and key stakeholders. And again, on Saturday at the conference, Chris Warren was able to really articulate just how important that was internally within the museum. It's an expense to invest in a mock-up, but for a project of this scale, it's incredibly important. From our point of view, other than anything else, this allowed us to shoot one of the sequences, which meant that then when we were shooting the other 15, we had a precedent in place. It meant that we were able to step people through the full experience, start to finish. Again, with some degree of smoke and mirrors, rather than necessarily need to build the full playback technology system. So one thing that dropped out at one stage of the project, remember the very, very initial still that I showed of our first sort of visual thinking for this project, had this idea of a forward shadow. So the idea of having a projector up high, casting some light onto the floor that gives a sense of shadow from the content. Now, this is something we tried to achieve in a different way during that full-scale testing, and didn't work. Obviously, be able to fail at the right time in projects is really, really important. There were lots of different elements of this project that took quite a lot of testing. So those LED blades on the wall, for example, multiple different products that were tested, multiple different fabrications that were tested, multiple different ways of treating the content. So we tried to use LED to create this shadow effect on the floor. Didn't work. Went back to this sort of forward shadow via projection. And you can see it's a simple effect, but this obviously moves in real time with the person on screen. And I think it's one of the main things that people speak about after this idea that it feels like there's genuine depth here as well. Another way we achieve that as well is by using theatrical lighting. So rather than just sort of architectural lighting, we worked really closely with technical artistry throughout this project, which meant that we were able to wash these scenes in additional lighting. So here, this is a story about a young boy, Patrick. He witnesses a Zeppelin crash into a field behind his house in Hertfordshire in the UK. Good example here where then he's recalling this story as a set of memories of how vivid you can imagine that to be in a young boy's memory. And we're able to enhance that really with additional lighting, and just the colour, the texture really helps to bring these things away from just being screens. Last few slides before we wrap up. So production, incredibly important to work hand in hand with the curatorial team here to get the authenticity right from a production point of view. So casting was critical to that. So this is a chap on the left of the screen there, Stanley Gould Lee, who was a British airman. The image in the middle is actually something that I generated through Midjourney. The idea being here to see what it would look like if a modern day actor was playing that person. The image on the right then is the actor that we cast to play that role. So we had around 25 to 30 shortlisted actors role for this project, which was, real luxury. And Freddie, who was selected for this role, did an incredible job. Really, really pleased with that selection. We were able to then shortlist and recommend, here's 3 for each role to the museum team and give them sort of pros and cons to each individual approach, and get to the point where we're settled on each one. And alongside that was obviously the development of all the other production decisions that need to be right. So everything really from like in the top left here within Stanley's scene. So he's talking about seeing one of his colleagues shot down from the sky. So getting the planes right is important, getting the environment right that he would have been in at the right time of year, in the right part of France, for example. Lots and lots of individual things here to get right. Costume, obviously, but hair and makeup as well. So the cluster of images bottom left pulled together by Katie, our hair and makeup lead. She did a fantastic job working back and forth with ourselves and the client team to work out, in this particular situation, again, what is that sweet spot between authentically getting this right and be able to add a little bit of drama as well. And I think that line between, I guess, the poeticism of the storytelling and the literal facts as well, it's getting that balance right to be able to take the visitor on a journey, I think. And yeah, really important. Emma, our costume designer as well, did a fantastic job with Claire, our seamstress on set, but also having Chris Warren there from the museum team on set to work through all the nuances, really, from how dirty would someone be at this particular moment in time to exactly how individual pieces of weaponry should be held, but also to be able to work directly with the actors as well. So with Stanley's story, it's about seeing one of his friends, colleagues, shot down in a plane. Chris was able to point out to the very specific line in his script, which was taken from a diary entry, where it's the moment where ultimately are they going to fall to death in the plane, or are they going to be able to cut themselves free? And to know and understand the nuance of that particular phrasing in that moment, and for Chris to be able to work with it with ourselves on set, Luke, our director, Freddie, the actor, added so much power and really, really helped us to get this authenticity right. I think particularly now we live in a world where many people are trying to do many things in many different ways, and AI is a big part of that. That's not something you can deliver with AI. This is about human understanding and emotion. You're not going to get that through a comparison engine. So in terms of building up and developing our stories, scripted, storyboarded. So we turn our storyboards into simple animatics and be able to work with the actors to get a voiceover in place. Where's our sound designer to be able to start to pull together what the world building would look like there from an audio perspective as well. And you can see from the storyboard frames here that we end each piece as well with an epitaph for each person. And one thing that's really important to us to achieve here was a step towards virtual production. So we shot this against blue screen and green screen rather than sort of a full VP rig. However, the process was the important bit here, right? So each of these scenes has a digital map painted background, which establishes a world for the person to tell their story. We also use a range of motion graphics to be able to bring those stories to life. So there's a lot of movement in this scene, for example. You've got the clouds, you've got the snow, you've got this abstract memory of the planes, you've got gentle breeze onto the scenery around the actors. So when the actor's actually on set, all of these elements already exist. So we're able to comp in real time. We're able to project at full scale every small detail. So like the motivation for the lighting, for example, we worked with Paul Mortlock, fantastic DOP, who, knowing in advance, the build up to being on set, we've worked hand in hand to work out already where the lighting's going to be, what the motivation for the lighting's going to be, where the movement will be from the actor on set. And all that stuff meant nothing's left to chance, so that when things are actually installed in reality, that theatrical lighting adds up to the lighting in the scene, adds up to the lighting on set. All of that means that this feels like it's a genuine thing that's happening in front of the visitor. I want this to be a fully automated visitor experience. So triggered content, there's a motion sensor that triggers each sequence to start. We found throughout testing that there was then a query of when things stop and when things should stop. So what we did was we added an additional proximity sensor so that we know when somebody enters the space, we know when somebody leaves the space, and we can control playback accordingly. So it feels like a genuinely magical experience. And there's lots that we learned, I think, from this production as a whole, in terms of just how we were able to work together as a team to make sure that space felt like a genuine, authentic environment to step into. I think what we achieved with the acoustics was incredibly important. The human scale of those vistas that people step into really, really helped get this right. And I think for me, all the individual nuances that sort of step us towards making these stories feel authentic. We're in a museum setting. Nobody walks into this space and thinks this is a real person stood in front of them. But there's a suspension of disbelief and there's a feeling of getting lost and immersed within a story through its authenticity. And hopefully what I've communicated today and what we went through on Saturday with Chris Conte and Chris Warren really kind of helps to get that across in terms of how important those individual factors are to make sure that people believe these stories, because these are primary sources. These are stories that people wanted to be heard. And so it's important for us to be able to honour those in the right way. So we finished on Saturday with just a quick summary of the reception. As you can see from this slide, that there's been a number of different industry awards that the project's won, which is fantastic. But what was really nice was to be able to close the conversation on Saturday with Chris Warren talking about the reception on site from the visitors and how impactful these stories have been to many of the visitors on site. My favourite thing on Saturday, we were worried really getting the Saturday slot that a lot of people were heading home from Memorial Day weekend. Would we get the crowds in? There were so many consecutive sessions happening at the same time. We got about 120 people in there, which is fantastic. And I think we probably went through, 8 to 10 questions at the end for about 15 minutes. That was probably a third of the hands that were up, which to me says we either created a lot of intrigue or we were really unclear in terms of what we were saying. And I think it was the intrigue because the questions were great and we could have continued for a long time afterwards answering more questions. So yeah, I just wanted to share this online for those who couldn't be there on Saturday. And again, just big thanks to AAM for having us involved, big thanks to Electrosonic for organising, and for Chris Warren to join us for a great week at the conference. So hopefully that's been helpful. I'll drop comments below and yeah, get in touch if you get any further questions and follow-ups. Thank you.